So getting them, so if they say, okay, I wake up at 8 o'clock, okay, what's the first thing you do when you wake up? I make coffee. Okay, do you have a coffee maker? Doing this hour-to-hour schedule with someone really allows you to identify things that they might need for their apartment. If they don't have a coffee maker, I mean, ideally it's best when someone moves in at the beginning of the month because hopefully they would have gotten a check and they'll have a little bit of extra money, and you can really budget for those things like a coffee maker. Because if someone has been in the shelter for a long time, they're used to having their coffee, there's coffee urns there, and they take it and they don't really think about, oh, I'm going to have to buy coffee, I'm going to have to buy filters, I'm going to have to buy a coffee maker. And then you sort of work from there. So you wake up, you have coffee, then what do you do? And I think that, you're going to have people that, some people are more introverted and may spend a lot of their time indoors, and some people may sort of be out and about doing things. The neat thing about doing this kind of planning with someone is that you can really tailor it to what their own needs are. But I think once they're in their housing, you also sort of review that and see what's changed or what it might be different than how they imagined it. And you always have to factor in things like transportation time, depending on where they're housed. And again, you sort of preface this with a discussion about the importance of structure. And I think the important part here is that people think that when you're talking about structure, that it's all doctor's appointments or support groups or these very sort of clinical or sort of dry kinds of things. But you can structure fun time and enjoyment and, non-clinical or non-dry things. I think that's really important to have a real balance there. You don't want someone to feel like they're sort of in boot camp. You want them to really also relax and enjoy their new home. So if you schedule in 2 hours of watching TV or 3 hours of watching TV, it's just you don't want someone either having 18 doctor's appointments per day or watching 18 hours of television. I think neither one of those ends of the spectrum is good for the patients. You want to sort of have this real, in a lot of ways it mirrors sort of like this, it mirrors a healthy diet where you want a lot of different elements and a lot of sort of variety, because I think that's really what adds richness to people's lives. And when you combine that with sort of really helping them find their sense of purpose, I think it all sort of should dovetail into a better living environment for them, which is the goal. So again, we talk about triggers for anxiety, for stress, for relapse. I think it's great to discuss that up front, and I think it's great to discuss that when the person is housed, after the person's housed. I think it's a given that life has ups and downs, and and ups and downs are actually a good thing. And you work with people through the tough times, and then when they're having sort of an up period, you really sort of like point out to them sort of that the sense of well-being that they're experiencing is, that the housing contributes to that, and that the housing is a byproduct of their hard work. I mean, I think you always bring it back to the hard work that they put in to get the housing and the hard work that it takes to maintain the housing. So again, we have a question here, what helps keep you sane? Again, I think you're going to get a million different answers. Some people might really, like having something like a computer might really help them focus. Or something like, having the TV on might allow them to clear a space to think about other things, like sort of having some background noise. And some people might want to be out, very social people, out doing stuff, and sort of socializing, that kind of stuff, and or working or volunteering somewhere. And I think it's going to be different for everyone. But I think when you're talking to someone both before and during, I think it's important to track it. I think it's important to record it somehow and to refer to it, because housing is not a static thing. It's a living thing, and it sort of expands and contracts. And housing changes over time, because I think the meaning of the housing changes over time for the person who is housed. And again, that exact meaning will differ from client to client. We have on here discussing the pros and cons of using a payee service. We're going to come back to that because, again, this will pop up regularly. It's like whack-a-mole or something where it just rears its head on a regular basis because There are people, like I think everyone has financial problems on a regular basis. I don't know of many people that can sort of just do whatever they want whenever they want. So sort of budgeting and a healthy state of mind are directly connected because money is it's anxiety provoking. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Is this the button I use?
It works sometimes.
Sometimes, sorry.
You can click the, see that arrow down there?
Ah, I'm learning how to use PowerPoint as we speak. So again, you know, we're thinking in terms of baby steps, and the goal is to really sort of take small steps, and then after you've gone quite a distance, to really, again, remind the patient about how much they've accomplished through taking baby steps. It's an approach that not only applies to housing, it applies to just about everything in most people's lives. The thing that I noticed in compiling these slides is that at the, you know, sort of before someone's house, there's a lot more nuts and bolts, sort of resources oriented. And then sort of when someone's housed, there's sort of this behavioral health component that comes into play. I think that even just working with clients on a day-to-day basis, we do a lot of sort of de facto behavioral health work. And I think it's really important to know sort of when to, I think it's good to connect most clients that you're going to work with some sort of behavioral health supports. But we also do a little bit of it in our day-to-day housing advocacy and case management. So again, in terms of baby steps, we're encouraging our patients to think of housing in whatever unit however small a unit they're comfortable with. So, you know, if we're taking, you know, if people are more comfortable thinking about housing as, you know, month to month, you know, they have a 1-year lease, but they really want to think of it in 30-day units, or they really want to make it through the week, see how that goes, and then tweak it for the next week. Or if they want to sort of, you know, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, you're going to have people that are more comfortable with housing and people where it really is anxiety provoking. So if we just take it a week at a time with some people, and that's, you know, and that's their choice, I think that's great. And then there's also sort of the terms of the lease. So if we're working with a client and we're taking it in 1 week increments, but we're also sort of focusing on this 365-day, this is when your lease is up. That's an important marker because it lets you know sort of, you know, midway through is when you start, you know, you really assess things. You say, what do you think of this housing? Let's take stock. Let's do an inventory. Do you like this housing? Do you want to stay there for another year? Are you able to stay there for another year? Or are we thinking about maybe sort of moving on to the next place? Because you will have patients who sort of hit it right the first time and they move into that apartment where it really has most of what they need and they want to stay there as long as possible. That really is an ideal situation. But I find more commonly the patients, you know, need to sort of take, you know, think of housing as a stepping stone. So, you know, we're in this place. It has most of what you need, but we can do better. And after about 6 months, we're going to start filling out the applications, you know, or maybe even sooner. It really depends on, you know, what the housing resources in your area are like and whether they have a particular place in mind and what that housing looks like. But I think, you know, I think no matter what kind of housing your patient's in or client is in, you know, it's rare that you find something that's 100% perfect the first time around. And also, you will have patients who will move into housing and it may not work out. And that's okay. I mean, that's par for the course. On the slide here, you know, it says, don't be afraid to admit temporary defeat. I would never frame it with a client as a defeat. I mean, I would just say it sounds like maybe now, it sounds like maybe we want to take a break from housing now and we want to regroup and reapproach this subject in a little bit. But I think the strengths perspective would be that this gives us just a chance to figure out how we can avoid whatever went astray from going astray next time. I think sometimes patients are very reluctant to admit when their housing is kind of going south, and they think that you will judge them for it or think less of them. So, and I would say up front to a patient, I said, not all housing works out all the time. The important part is that you give me a heads up if there's anything wrong or it looks like things, or even if you just don't want to be there, it's okay to say that. I think it's more important to preserve your housing options. If someone has an eviction on their housing record, that can be a real blow. It can be a real barrier. Or if someone, has an open case or goes to jail because they just couldn't cope with their housing and couldn't find a way to address it with you. So again, it comes back to this concept of communication and openness being the key to a good working relationship. If the housing does fail for some reason, I think it's, there will be this mitigation process where, the next time you're housed, they're going to want to know about your housing history. And I think you may need, you may possibly need letters of support from service providers, other people in the community that this client works with. And if someone's housing doesn't work out, I think that's actually a good way to connect people with services that they might previously have been reluctant to engage with, because it is a way to build those relationships. And the patient or client may think that it's for the purpose of getting these letters of support, but once they get there, they may actually find that they receive true, genuine support, and they may stay engaged in services even after they've been there for a while. So the letter of support is why you may connect them, but you'll be surprised by the wonderful things that come out of connecting people with resources. All right. Another slide. So again, before someone's housed, you're saying, what do you think life will be like for you once you're housed? And you're recording that. And then once they're housed, you're asking them the exact same question. And you're looking at it under a microscope to really find out what those differences are and how things have changed. As I said earlier, it's like, our patients, our clients, the components of their lives change, and for a number of different reasons, and they change as people. So I think over time you're going to see a lot of differences, but you'll also see some of these themes that remain constants, that remain the same. So I think it's really important when you find something that remains the same to ask them, to talk with them and say, well, why is this the same? Why have these other things changed, but this is the same? And really sort of get that dialogue happening. Because there are some things that are going to stay the same, that need to stay the same, and there are some things that are going to stay the same that maybe, it might be good to eventually replace those with other things. But getting to that point can be a whole process. And as much as possible, you want it to be an organic process. Sitting down with them and saying, after they've been housed for a little while, what do you like about the housing and what don't you like? And I think in the course of that, you're going to find that there are things that can be changed and there are things that can't be changed. If someone is in an apartment and it's in the middle of the city and they don't like the street noise, I mean, there are things that you can do to sort of insulate against noise. But unless they're going to move to maybe for the next housing opportunity, moving to a quieter area might be on your list of things to do. But you can't stop traffic. You can get them earplugs. You can put up all sorts of things that will, absorb the sound. But so like an idea of something that you definitely can change is if the mailboxes are not secure. If they're worried about their mail, arriving safely and people are breaking into the mailboxes, you can definitely, address stuff like that with property management, and you should address things like that with property management. So it's good for the clients to recognize that we have superpowers, but those superpowers are limited. But more importantly, that we're on their side, and of course, if it's noisy and that's a barrier to a good night's sleep, that's going to affect quality of life, and we want to work on those issues. All of that, it makes sense and it's very logical. And again, because we're thinking of housing as a continuum, we're not thinking of it as a finish line, but sort of a new chapter, and that there are many other chapters to follow after that. I think the challenge is to keep the patient's mind as active as possible and engaged. I think it's an important reminder that patients frequently need more, not less support once they're housed. And in Massachusetts, we have so many more easily accessible, services are more accessible in shelters. So in Massachusetts, we're lucky there's 2 major shelters right near our health center. There are case managers in those shelters. They really want to connect people with resources, and they have case managers saying, how can I help you? What can we do today? What can we connect you with? When someone's a little bit more isolated when they're in their own housing, it's up to us and the other people that they work with in their community to really connect them with things. And it's more up to them to actually verbalize what their needs are. I would never want for someone to think, oh, well, you're housed, you really shouldn't be complaining about anything. We don't think about it as complaining, and also we want people to continue verbalizing whatever it is their needs are, and if we can help them, we will certainly do everything we can. And if we can't, it's our responsibility, our duty to connect them with resources or places that can help them with those requests. I think that keeping the patient's mind active and engaged is really important because I think housing can just, it can trigger a lot of very complex emotions for our patients, especially when they're by themselves or during certain times of year. I think we find at our health center that Christmas, before and after, is a particularly tough time for patients. And I think that's probably true maybe of a lot of the clients that you serve. But I think there are probably other times of year that might be more difficult for your clients. And I think some of those factors may depend on location or other factors that are not coming to mind right now. But I think just asking a client, are there particular times of year when it's particularly difficult for you to get by? Because I think that should sort of coincide with some of these times when it may be difficult to stay housed or to be housed or to feel comfortable in your housing. So again, it comes back to that communication being real key to that working relationship. Coming back to structure, it's everything. Transportation, we've touched on it before. In Boston, it seems like the most easily accessible housing is out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if that's true in your area. This would be a great thing for people to type in or talk about how accessible housing is. But if someone is an hour and a half away on public transportation, that's real tough. Because it seems like a lot of different resources have these very specific sort of like service regions. And if someone gets housed outside of a service region, is there something in that new area that you can connect them with? I think long before someone's housed, I think it's worth really, getting on the computer, or if you have connections at local agencies, really calling there and seeing on a very concrete basis what they can offer your soon-to-be housed patients. But even after your patient is housed, I think checking in with them if they've gotten connected with a resource about whether that's meeting their needs, and if not, how you can adapt it. I think that's very, very important. And again, I think so when we're talking about encouraging our newly housed patients to think in blocks of 365 days in terms of housing, that sort of leasing period, that one-year lease, if they have a one-year lease. I think also thinking in blocks of times in terms of connecting people with resources. I think it can be very nerve-wracking. So, if someone moves 45 minutes away on public transportation, they really don't feel like coming in to attend a support group at our health center. We connect them with a support group in another, at another area agency or health center. I think the agreement that I would want to have with someone, I think it'd be very nerve-wracking to walk into a place that you don't know anything about or have never been to. I think it helps for us to accompany our patients to someplace new so they can get acclimated. But I think also pitching it in terms of like a length of time to acknowledge, I know, I wouldn't expect you to really get the feel for a support group by going once or twice. How do you feel going 4 times in a row? Seeing what you think, and if you really don't like it or it doesn't meet your needs, we can reassess then and see what else we can connect you with. But really sort of being as concrete as possible up front about these blocks of time. go to this food pantry. Would you feel comfortable going to this food pantry 6 times to see what it's like? Because, if you go to a support group once and things are sort of a little off kilter, it might just be this isolated experience where, it's just a kind of a rough day at the support group. It doesn't give you the full picture. If someone goes 4 or 5 or 6 times, they're going to get a feel for it. And I'd hate for someone to sort of, I'd hate for someone to discard a resource without really knowing what it's really about. And also, I think if someone goes to a support group and they have a less than optimal experience, also they're in a position to give feedback about that support group or that particular resource. And theoretically, all resources are sort of like the gas in their tank is feedback from the people who access those services. So if they go to a support group and they have feedback on how it could be better, and they actually give that feedback, and it does get better, then maybe they'll sort of stick with it. But I'd like to think that any sort of support group or any resource where people are allowed to participate, where their voice is heard, and where they feel fulfilled, they'll get something out of it, and it will be fulfilling for them. So that's ultimately what we hope for. And then there's this list of kind of scary, overwhelming stuff at the bottom. Discuss the following topics. A lot of these are kind of ongoing things. Utility shutoff protection. In Massachusetts, very easy to do. Every 3 months, letter from your doctor, and it prevents the utility company from turning off your utilities if for some reason there's a problem paying them. Simultaneously, you'd want to be doing this, applying for any sort of utilities assistance. Hopefully your area has some sort of LIHEAP or governmental funds to assist with utilities. They're not cheap. Even better would be if your patient or client gets a place where utilities are included. And a lot of times that is very, very possible. Food stamps and food resources in the area. In Massachusetts, people's food stamps go up once they're housed. That's a given. But they have to go in with a copy of the lease and any other bills they might be paying as proof so that the food stamps can be increased. And again, hopefully your area has a healthy network of food resources. In Massachusetts, we have a single hotline that you can call that goes by zip code and has a listing of all the food pantries and meals programs across the state. I don't know if your area does. And sometimes food resources are word of mouth, but I find that churches are a good place to check, and health centers and other places. Actually, I find that when patients are in a shelter, they're less likely to go to church even if they really want to, but once they're housed, they're really gung-ho, and I think it's a great thing to connect people with if that's what they want. And out of that, they can also find out about other resources in the faith-based community. A lot of times churches can assist with things like rental assistance. They have funds for that. Day programs or drop-in centers. Again, we have a lot of them here. It really is just a question of fit. We have day programs for elderly people. We have day programs for people in recovery or who are coping with active substance use. We have day programs that are Spanish language only. And again, if these resources don't exist in your area, maybe somehow having the clients that you serve voice the need for it, maybe will create the resource itself. But again, it's a great way for clients to really advocate for their own needs. And in Massachusetts, we have a mayor's hotline where people can call, and we have a contact at the Department of Public Health where people can call to really give feedback about resources that are needed in the community. We have some very open and willing ears at a higher level, higher state level, and I think that's really crucial. And libraries, other public resources. If someone likes using the computer, but they don't have a computer, library is a great place to use one. I think, the libraries still have VHS tapes. They still have DVDs. They have lots of books. And sometimes they have things like GED classes, at least in Massachusetts, GED classes, reading groups. So I think libraries are a really good resource. And I think if you've identified getting a GED or returning to school, or even just taking the basic literacy classes as part of a client's wish list, I think the library will be a great, quiet, sane space where people can sort of do their homework or just peruse, browse. Yeah, libraries are kind of like churches. They're just very quiet, sacred spaces. That's how I've always thought of them. And then that sort of discussion about financial resources, financial obligations is a very tough one to have, because if you list all of their monthly financial obligations in one place, that can be kind of overwhelming. I think, hopefully the rent should be easily affordable, and hopefully utilities will be included. Cell phone, that's a tough one. A lot of people, I think most of the states represented on this call should have access to the, Assurance Wireless or SafeLink phones. Those are affordable. They have a certain number of minutes on them. I think when you get into things like food, cable, non-essential essentials, first off, you're going to hear a lot of people talk about cable. I think it is very necessary if someone's spending a lot of time indoors. And more so if you live in an area where there's snow or seasons where it's not great to be outside. I would rather have someone watching a Golden Girls marathon than sort of bored out of their minds and more prone to relapse. So you'll hear people who have never tried to live on a small, like this amount of money per month saying they don't need cable. I think people do need cable. I think whatever occupies their mind comes back to that question, what keeps you sane? And, I bring up the cable thing because I have a patient who was housed a week and a half ago. This is exactly what keeps him sane. Painting and watching cable TV. And you know what? It doesn't have to be cable as long as there's channels, a few channels there with some reasonable programming. So I say cable, but I guess I mean TV. Non-essential essentials. Again, there's always going to be someone who says you don't need X, Y, or Z. I don't see why you need this. Like a non-essential essential would be, you know what? I stay on my diet all week. I don't use all week. I want to go out on a Sunday afternoon and I want to eat out at a restaurant and no more than $10, but I want to go out and get some junk food. I want to go out and have a burger and fries and a Coca-Cola. Totally reasonable. Non-essential essentials. There's no medical reason. There's no justifiable reason other than it helps, if someone has that thing to look forward to, that ritual, that, they're good all week and they want to be a little bad on Sunday. It's great. Go for it. I think those are very important things. And I think it's important for our patients to know that not only do we understand, but we're the same way. Every Friday after work, I go to Goodwill. It's right down the street as part of my ritual. But I think if you could incorporate it into someone's sort of structure and their schedule, I think it's a great tool to help someone just sort of like feel a little bit freer and feel a little bit more comfortable. My thought on that. I think mapping out the transportation stuff, having subway and bus maps on the fridge or wherever easily available, other forms of transportation, making sure the mail is secure, as I talked about earlier. People can always have mail delivered care of a case manager. I think these are all the nuts and bolts things that when I talk about being as specific as possible with clients, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And I think even if a client's mail was secure at their apartment, they may not feel comfortable having it mailed there. And if you're comfortable having it mailed to you, I think that's great. I think furthermore, that's a great way to connect with a client by having weekly mail pickup. They come in, they pick up their mail, you look at the mail together, but also they check in with you about how things are going. Or if your client doesn't have a phone and there isn't some way to get them a phone, I mean, if people want to come in and call family or friends once a week from your office with you, we do that, and I think that's reasonable. I just don't think that we want to do anything where someone feels penalized in some way for being housed. So if someone, when they're in the shelter, had a case manager that will let them use the phone, and now they're not in the shelter, they can't do that. They have to be able to keep in touch with their regular contacts. Social groups, book clubs, and one thought that I had was, maybe if your sites have the capacity to, I think a support group, if there isn't some sort of support group in your area, maybe a support group for recently housed people, might be a good idea. Maybe a group with, 5 or 10 people that show up every week and you talk about the successes and challenges of being housed. I think stuff is always more meaningful when it comes to when information comes from and opinions come from other clients having parallel experiences. I think that always means more than what we have to say. All right. So, and again, we want our patients, we're talking about the patients that are housed an hour and a half away on public transportation, which oddly enough can sometimes be only a 20-minute drive. But if it's a bus to a bus to a train to a bus and then walking, that can be a real challenge. So we want our patients, I almost think that if a patient, if housing comes up and it's too far away, you really want to, I feel like we have an obligation to really be upfront with the patients about weighing the pros and cons, because the end goal here is having our patients be housed, have a certain, a quality of life, a better quality of life, and remain in care. We want all three of those factors. So best would be, close to, best type of housing, close to care. Obviously housing adds stability and it allows us to do home visits. And, a bad location can have a number of issues. Because if someone called, this patient, I keep coming back to this patient that I housed a week and a half ago, he is half an hour 40 minutes on public transportation. I walked 10 or 15 minutes to the bus. It's about 20, 25 minutes on the bus. If he called me and said, I have an emergency, I need you here right now, having that gap, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. I guess in the grand scheme of things, 40 minutes is not so bad. But I would hate for there to be some sort of emergency and he's 4.5 miles away. So this slide, acquiring housing can be exhausting. It could have fit anywhere in and amongst these slides. It could have been the first slide. It would be a great reminder as the last slide. It's something that we keep coming back to. We have to acknowledge to the patient that housing acquiring housing can be exhausting, the housing process. And even after that, being in housing. I think it's fine to say, take a breather, we're going to take a break, unless they don't want to. If they say, I want to keep going, then you keep going. But I think it's fine if someone wants to take a few days and just veg. It really depends on sort of what type of situation they're coming from, who they are as an individual, and then sort of what type of housing they're heading into. I think it's hard for people to take a few days to veg because, if they're in housing and you've connected with a housing, like a furniture bank and other resources, there's usually some sort of unpacking and setting up and maybe some painting to be done. So it's hard to sort of really take that few days to sort of completely unwind. But you do take a quick breather and then you say, okay, so what are the next set of goals? And really keep people moving. Comes back to that idea of structure being really key to someone's improved quality of life. And the goals can be housing goals, non-housing goals, a mixture of both. Again, a question as simple as what would you like to work on next, or what's the next move, or what's the next challenge. Someone may say, you know what, I have a year lease, I want to take a couple months to really settle in here, but I've really been thinking a lot about going back to school. Then you sort of like sit down and you investigate what steps it would take to get someone to go back to school. And you want to make sure that your timelines are sort of staggered. So, someone going back to school maybe 6 months after they've been housed wouldn't conflict with, their lease renewal coming up or housing search. you definitely, sometimes it's hard to know where people's breaking point is. And if you're good at reading like nonverbal cues, you'll kind of know. Or if you're like me, you'll just ask them every 5 minutes, this isn't too much, is it? Because hopefully they'll say, I'm feeling a little bit saturated, I'm feeling like it is a little bit too much. People need to understand with housing, with goals, with anything, they can change those at any point. They can say, you know what, I thought I wanted to go back to school now. I think actually I might want to try for next semester. That's fine. And I actually had a patient do that recently. She was enrolled at a local institute and simultaneously looking for housing. And she just found that she could either do one or the other. And she wisely said, I want to put the school on the back burner. But then after we talked about it for a while, she changed her major altogether. And I think that was a really hard thing for her to arrive at because it involves a certain amount of introspection. It involves a certain amount of self-examination. And if you're working with people that have just been in a shelter and just trying to get by, there's not a lot of time for that kind of introspection. So I think in a way you can kind of be opening a bit of Pandora's box by really encouraging someone to really think about who they are or who they'd like to be. And I think, again, it comes back to that need to really connect people with behavioral health. Maybe I've been doing case management too long, but I can't see how behavioral health services couldn't help, even if it's sort of intermittent. I mean, I think if you're factoring in a certain amount of stress on an ongoing basis, I mean, I think a support group or working with a counselor, it's bound, it's a good, even if someone doesn't want to engage on a regular basis, having that having that in reserve for when you need it is a really, really good thing. Because you never do know when you will need it. I think a lot of times people get housed, maybe sort of the pressure in their lives lessens a little bit, and that allows them to connect with family and friends on a deeper level. And sometimes there can be stuff going on with family and friends that can be just as stressful as stuff that was going on in their lives. So even recently I've had some patients with parents or brothers or sisters being ill unexpectedly, and it can really just sort of take things in a whole new direction, having to deal with that stress. Changes in household composition. So it's, ideally, people get housed and then sort of like, their lives move on in an orderly fashion. Maybe they start dating someone, or maybe they get married, or maybe they get divorced, or all the things on this list, reuniting with family. I think you can ask someone sort of what their goals are beforehand. And I think that some of these things can absolutely affect housing. I mean, if you have an individual who's technically on paper married, they move into an apartment of their own with just their name on the lease, I don't think them getting divorced one way or the other is going to affect their housing. But I think if someone gets married, it could very, very easily affect their housing. And that could lead to having kids. So I think really talking to them about what their sort of future goals are will help tease some of this out. And again, I don't know if the language is the same from state to state, but we have this thing called reasonable accommodation. So-and-so was in a shelter, they got housed, and now they want to regain custody of their 8-year-old child who has been living with a family member. How can we accommodate them housing-wise? And I think in some cases, depending on what kind of housing they're in, I think there are definitely ways to accommodate them. So again, I think it really involves doing some legwork ahead of time to find out what the goals are and then sort of what resources are out there. I know in Massachusetts, with our housing authority, if there was a change in household composition, and it was someone like, an 8-year-old, and the parent did regain custody, I think it would definitely be, housing options for them. But again, if you're talking about sort of, it's funny, in some places like San Francisco, I just think of the real estate as being so wacky, but on the other hand, there are so many more resources there because it is such a client-friendly environment that maybe it might be easier if someone, regained custody of a child to get housing. It really depends on the circumstances of your locale. look at my notes for this slide. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, dating while housed. This is a tricky one. Again, we're not in a position we're not in a position to tell people what they can, can't, should, shouldn't do. I think that we are in a position to inform them, what the rules of their current housing are and what could jeopardize their housing. So I think there's two components to that. I mean, it is this negotiating healthy relationships and retaining housing. I think there are two separate things that are directly connected. And I think even after you discuss the rules of housing, I think it's also important to discuss the rules of safety. And again, I think those are two similar but not the same things. Those are two similar things that are not the same. I think reviewing the lease together is always a good idea. And really just, it becomes a stupid soundbite, but you really do want to remind people again and again what the rules of their lease are. So if it says really you're not allowed to have overnight guests, and I'm not afraid to sound like an idiot just saying at the end of every conversation, every meeting, I just want to really remind you about this thing about no overnight guests. If you do it and you're caught, there will be repercussions. If someone's goal in the next housing is to move into a place where they are allowed to have overnight guests, I think that's a great goal. But if someone's agreeing to housing, they have to go by whatever the terms of the current housing are. It's what they agreed to, and violating those rules can really chomp them. I mean, I don't think anyone that goes to the effort of being housed wants to lose housing. So yeah, and I've had patients who have paid their rent faithfully, but who were evicted due to the behavior of house guests. Having a lot of traffic coming in, having a lot of people in the building notice that, having a lot of people that live in that building report those house guests to property management. I've had patients get evicted because of that. It's a real problem. Again, I'll put in a plug for behavioral health, connecting people with behavioral health resources to help the client navigate those ups and downs of either having them navigate the stress of either being alone or the behavior of the house guests or the behavior of the person that they're dating who may be on site. Again, you can also put in a plug for maybe, if they're dating someone for meeting outside of the house or at this person's house instead of their housing so it doesn't jeopardize the housing. But if it's two grown adults and it's in the lease that they can have, visitors and they're quiet and keep to themselves, that's great. That's an ideal situation. Also, I think it's a great place to put in a plug about safer sex. I mean, you really do want to talk to your patient about sexual behaviors and definitely arm them with condoms and lube and, information about all the stuff that's out there right now, because we see surges in things like syphilis, we see surges in things like chlamydia, and a lot of our, I think a lot of our patients are very at home talking to us about their behaviors. I think we have a few where it's kind of, it's kind of difficult for them to discuss. So if we're not the person they can talk to, maybe another resource where they can really open up and talk about the nitty-gritty of their dating life and really keeping them and their partners as safe and as healthy as possible. Again, we want to do anything we can to avoid eviction on the housing history. And you're going to have patients that have that invite people into their homes. I guess it's important to start thinking about, what are some reasons people invite guests into their homes. I know when people are coming from a shelter, if word gets around that someone has a place, someone gets housing, I think people want to get in on that. It's a win-win for them. They can do, ideally, you can go to someone's house, do whatever you want, and there are no repercussions. People can go there instead of going to the shelter. But it's usually a very, very bad idea. It usually gets out of hand pretty quickly. And I've found more often than not, if people invite strangers into their homes, I think it can be very difficult to work up the nerve to ask someone to leave. Because I think the usual response they'll get is, oh, I thought we were friends, or you've changed since you were in the shelter, or people will think that your client is putting on airs by asking them to leave, when in fact it's actually their right to ask the person to leave, and they should ask the person to leave. This comes up again and again. You'd be amazed how often it comes up. I think, again, it's important to acknowledge to the person that you're housing that this is going to bring up some issues, or it could and it probably will. Because even if they're out in the community and they run into people who they haven't seen in a while, where have you been? I haven't seen you in a while. I'm housed. Sort of fending off people who are just sort of a little bit pushy and don't have housing of their own and want to get in on that. I mean, I think that's tough. You have to be on guard all the time, and that's, you don't want people feeling defensive and jumpy and on guard. You want people to feel relaxed and casual and proud of their housing, but also setting very firm boundaries at the same time. So again, these sort of outside guests, people from the shelter or people from the street, could serve as a trigger relapse or overdose. So again, you want to talk to people about Narcan if it's available and in your area. I assume that it is, and this is something I would love to see people talk about on the MedHeart website, whether they talk to their patients about Narcan, and if so, how they do it, and if so, what those results have been. Again, I think sometimes patients are sort of like they're doing a balancing act. They may either feel that because they've been housed, that they're expected to act a certain way or not act a certain way. Really, all that we want our clients to do is to be themselves in their housing. And if that does involve any sort of like substance use or risky sexual behaviors, we want to address it and sort of just make sure they're as safe as possible. But even if someone said, I've started dating someone, I don't know the person's status, I don't know if they know mine, and I don't want to use condoms. I mean, you have to respect their wishes and sort of gently push for change over time, or at least make people aware of what the options are, and hope eventually they do sort of want to talk to you about what it means to use condoms or what the barriers to using condoms have been in the past. Or even just say to someone, I totally hear that that's not something, you don't want to use condoms at this time. You got nothing to lose by taking them home and just having them handy just in case. Can't hurt to have them on site. And again, if they refuse that, that's their own wish. But you're putting it out there, you're making them aware of their options. Speaking of options, time is growing short. So again, this, at the bottom of the slide, how do you balance helping your patients feel relaxed versus encouraging them to guard themselves from danger? I mean, feeling relaxed in their own housing and then going out into the community and sort of being who they were out in public, it kind of must feel a little bit like having two different identities. Like, how do you bridge the gaps between those two different identities? I don't know the answer to that, and I think that over time that the person you've housed will have to find their own answers for that. The number one rule, again, you can say it throughout the entire process, this is your housing. It's what you make it. So if you have an unwanted guest in your house and they're sort of throwing shade or accusing you of being this, that, or the other, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is this is your housing. I mean, your housing has to be the way that you want it, and anything that jeopardizes your housing, you're the one that loses. So very, very important that people recognize this throughout this whole process. And I think I said this last time in part one of this webinar, I apologized to a patient that I had doubts about actually being housed long-term, but she's done a wonderful job. And I said, you've done such a great job with your housing, and now you can look forward to, we can work on the next housing opportunity, but none of this would be possible without you holding on to this and preserving the housing, paying your rent, really being a real champ when it comes to paying rent on time and sort of being orderly in your housing. It's great. You have to, I think a lot of times we don't recognize when people are doing something right. I try and recognize it every time I think of it. And I think, troubleshooting sort of ways to avoid problems in future is always a great idea. Pets are a great way to help for people to not feel as lonely in their housing. And it's a great way for clients to learn caregiving skills. So again, check the lease. Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? Your lease will spell it out very, very clearly. But even if it says no pets, I think they're referring to cats and dogs and horses and lobsters. I think if you wanted to get a fish, I don't think any landlord in their right mind would have a problem with that, or a tiny little frog. But again, there's something more tactile about cats and dogs. And even if your lease says no, sometimes for medical reasons, to reduce anxiety, clients could have cats or dogs. I wouldn't get like a 150-pound bull mastiff. I would get a small, quiet dog. Again, there are many different pets out there. Some are louder than others. Choose a quiet, obedient, small one if you can. Any number of patients or clients really report that having a cat or a dog to look after and to look after them has been remarkably beneficial. And then you want to look for resource, like how, when you're talking about this nuts and bolts, day-to-day stuff, how are you going to afford, food or other supplies? What's the budget for this? And are there places in your community that will help you? And if there are, I say hooray. Tips and tools. That's it. Here, tips and tools. So we really want to get our patients writing down or tracking. I mean, we can write down how they feel, but really meeting regularly to see how they're doing. And again, because we're looking for any sort of patterns, are there times of the day, week, or month that are more stressful? I think for most people, the end of the month when money's tight, that's clearly more stressful. But if someone says to you, every time I talk to my sister, it just causes me such anxiety, and they speak to their sister once a week, then you know that's going to be a time of the week that they're going to be more stressed. We're looking for long and short-term solutions. Sometimes talking to your sister may be less often, and maybe at the beginning of the month when you're in a better mood, maybe that's a solution. But again, really using those motivational interviewing tools to help the client come up with their own solutions is key, and prompting them when you need to, and really kind of pushing them. Because we want to track stuff on a regular basis. I think it's fine to say, I was thinking about something you said 3 weeks ago, about your stress level, and I've noticed that you're just as stressful now. What can we do about that? I think it shows to the client that you're really listening to what they say. You're not just tracking it, here's what's in print, but you've really been thinking about it. You said 3 weeks ago you were stressed. You thought the stress would go away after check day came, but I'm talking to you now and I'm kind of getting a sense that you're just as stressed. Is there something different that's causing the stress? And could it be something sort of organic, or is it situational? Would working with a therapist or someone to really examine this under a microscope help? Because the bottom line is that you listen to them and that stress is bad for their health. I mean, I think those are the takeaway points. And you don't want them to think, the takeaway is that you don't want them to think that you're judging them or that they're stressed and therefore they're bad, or you just want the problem to, you want the situation to lighten up a little bit. You want them to have some relief, some peace of mind. Again, coming up like journaling, you're having them write down their feelings or their sleep patterns, or sort of their, times of the month when maybe they're having more like stomach issues, whatever it is that you want to track, sort of their moods throughout the month. But then you're also tracking sort of like important and or emergency numbers, regular contacts. You want to make sure this is updated on a regular basis. So if you have someone coming in once a week or you're seeing them every day, you can sort of take a quick scan of the stuff, make sure their contact information is the same. I think sometimes people get housed and maybe change their cell phone number, or change, maybe they get a P.O. box and they want mail going that. Going to the P.O. box instead of to the home address. We won't know that stuff unless they tell us. So it's sort of like, how are you doing? Every time you see them, how are things? Is there any new information I need to know? I know last time we were working on these goals. Are these goals still the same, or do we want to add some or take some away? And then sort of going over those, reminders of regular appointments that you have, medical appointments and other appointments in the community. So everyone here was really good about contributing to some, during the last all grantee meeting about sort of building tools that will help our patients. So we have some of those sample tools on the MedHeart website, and I'd really encourage you to look at those and again, give us feedback if they need to be changed or if you have ways in which they could be tweaked or improved. We definitely want to know about that stuff. I think that's about it for part 2. Was that all right for everyone?
Was for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James.
Sure.
So it's 1 o'clock. We're going to wrap up, but just a couple of announcements. I want to just kind of reiterate what James said about the tools that are posted on the MedHeart website. I know that
The following slide.
Oh,
Or exactly
okay,
where they're
good.
located. Yep.
Yeah.
So these are the tools. This is where you would access them on the grantee site.
Excellent.
So you go into the grantee resources and click on grantee meetings and trainings, and then the April 2014 meeting materials. So there'll be.
One more.
And those are the 2 tools.
So the 2 tools are the pre-housing checklist and the patient weekly schedule template. And I wasn't in that session, but that's something that James and Mishka worked on with all of you at our last meeting. So I would just encourage everyone to check those out and feel free to send feedback, share with your colleagues on site. And our next webinar is on June 18th, the 3rd Wednesday of next month. So we'll be sending reminders for that. Are there any other reminders, Mishka?
No, next week in the newsletter we will have the agenda and registration forms for the August intervention staff meeting here in Boston. So please be on the lookout for that.
I'm going to see some folks in New Orleans next week. I hope you come up and say hello.
Yeah, so James and I will be with our colleagues from Multnomah and AIDS Arms and Pasadena. Will be at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council conference. And if anyone else is attending, please let us know. Reach out to us, and maybe we can schedule a time to meet or have dinner or something like that. So just let us know. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll post the recording of this webinar and the slides on the website as well. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.